European Union has introduced a carbon border adjustment mechanism this year. And this is without a doubt one of the most important policy innovations in climate economics. Now, the idea of a carbon border adjustment mechanism is simple. You want to impose a similar carbon tax on importing firms, similar to those faced by domestic firms. And as a result, proponents of this policy argue that you can improve domestic competitiveness, reduce emissions leakage, and encourage other countries to tax carbon. So that all sounds great on paper. However, opponents claim this will substantially harm EU consumers. In addition, some emerging economies claim their firms will be severely harmed as their firms now face higher export tariffs to the European Union. So the central question of this episode is the following. What are the estimated benefits and costs of the carbon border adjustment mechanism? And what are those costs and benefits for consumers and producers in the EU? And what are they for the rest of the world, in particular the emerging economies? And we will answer those questions based on a paper called The Global Effects of the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. And to discuss this paper, I'm delighted to have one of its authors with me today, namely Kim Clausing. And Kim is the Eric M. Zoll Chair in Tax Law and Policy at the UCLA School of Law and a non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, as well as a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. And during the early Biden administration, she served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Tax Analysis at the United States Department of the Treasury, acting as the lead economist in the Office of Tax Policy. So Kim, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
And I think CBAM is one of the most exciting developments taking place right now in climate economics. And so I did give you a brief introduction already, but would you just mind explaining what the carbon border adjustment mechanism is and why you decided to study it?
Absolutely. I think I agree with you that it's one of the most exciting things happening in climate policy. And what's really great about the CBAM is it provides an answer to the free rider problem, as you described it, because it makes it easier for countries to adopt ambitious climate policies, but it also makes it easier to facilitate climate action abroad. So let me just explain how it works. So imagine you're in Europe and there's an emissions trading system, and because you are phasing out the free allowances, your firms are now facing more and more costs associated with their carbon emissions. That puts your firms at a disadvantage relative to firms in other countries. So you'd worry that consumers might substitute goods that are dirtier than the domestically produced goods. So what a carbon border adjustment mechanism does is it simply negates that self-imposed competitiveness disadvantage. So it's not protectionist. It's more re-leveling the playing field after you've harmed your own producers by making them internalize this carbon cost. And so a nice feature of the EU carbon border adjustment mechanism is it also provides a credit if other countries have imposed carbon prices of their own. So imagine Indonesia has a carbon price equivalent of 20 euro and the European Union has a carbon price equivalent of 80 euro, then the difference of 60 euro would be the border adjustment mechanism, but they'd get credit for having a carbon price of their own. So this policy can really handle three important goals. One, addressing the leakage problem of people substituting for dirtier sources of production or even moving production to lightly regulated jurisdictions. Two, it can facilitate carbon price adoption at home because it has an answer to that competitiveness problem. And three, it facilitates carbon price adoption abroad because countries can convert foreign tariff revenue into domestic revenue and achieve some of their own climate policy goals.
Thank you. And I thought then maybe we could start with some also of the stylized facts you have in your paper, because I read some of those and I was surprised to see some of your results. So maybe we can start with those because I think they provide a very nice framework to then talk about your results. And maybe the first stylized fact or question you answer is, how does carbon pricing affect competitiveness? Could you maybe talk about that?
Yes, so carbon pricing in general, raises costs for your domestic firms. And so that's going to harm their competitiveness absent some sort of carbon border adjustment mechanism. What the carbon border adjustment mechanism does is it subjects foreign producers to your carbon price should they be serving your market. It doesn't really address the export problem. And that's part of why it's important to also incentivize action abroad. So let's say you're a German firm and you're subject to the European price. You can rest assured that in Europe, foreign firms will be subject to that too, but that doesn't mean you'll be on a level playing field when you're both trying to serve a third market abroad. So it's also important to think about how to facilitate more and more carbon price adoption throughout the world if you want to handle like the worldwide competitiveness problem, but at least the carbon border adjustment mechanism can solve the domestic competitiveness problem.
Exactly. It's like leveling the playing field domestically, but exactly internationally, it will remain different. So, and then one thing that I was surprised by is you look at how carbon pricing like affects producers in lower income countries, because the story that you often hear is there might be emission leakage and companies might move abroad where environmental regulations are less stringent, so emissions would go up. So you kind of look at this emission intensity also for those. So could you talk about that?
Yes, absolutely. And we were somewhat surprised by this finding that showed that really there wasn't a correlation between income per capita in countries and their emissions intensity. I think a lot of people going into this intellectual exercise thought, well, it's probably the case that the poorer countries have dirtier production, and so this would disproportionately harm them. And I think many early observers also made the mistake of not thinking through the true incidence of the carbon border adjustment mechanism. So it's not so much that it's harming poor countries if they're sending goods to Europe, because the European price will be higher because of carbon pricing. And the border adjustment mechanism is just undoing an advantage that they would otherwise be handing to the rest of the world. So there's kind of two types of misconceptions here. One is the kind of incidence question of who's really bearing the burden of this policy. But the second is, which firms will win and lose under this scenario. So Europe's going to have a higher price for goods like aluminum and steel. So selling to Europe comes with a premium. Those firms that are particularly green will actually on net benefit because they'll get a higher price, but their carbon fee won't be enough to offset the benefits of that high price. Whereas the dirty firms may find that this is bad for them because they're so carbon intensive that if they did serve Europe, they would have to face a high fee. They might end up reallocating their exports to other markets that aren't regulated, but then the prices in those markets will be driven down by the increase in supply, right? So you get this sort of tale of two types of firms where the clean ones may actually benefit and the dirty ones are harmed. So it becomes really important which firms are clean and which are dirty. And one thing we find using really detailed plant level data on every aluminum smelter in the world and most steel plants in the world is that there isn't a tight correlation between GDP per capita and emissions intensity. And this is true even if you control for a lot of other variables that you might think matter, like scale, foreign ownership, and the like. So that was surprising to us, but I think it's an encouraging message for the EU because they can implement this policy without worrying that it's going to have disproportionately negative effects on the poor countries of the world who really are suffering disproportionately from climate change in general because of where they're located in the world.
Yeah, I think rephrasing that, there's also a lot of very efficient firms abroad that are not often captured in this story. So it's like there's going to be disproportionate burden. But also those countries also have very efficient firms that don't emit a lot, which I think was something that I really learned. Then I would actually say that maybe there's also a good transition to talk about the two industries that you study. You mentioned aluminum and steel. Could you maybe talk why you chose those industries?
Yes. So the European Union CBAM was the policy instrument we were interested in looking at, and it applies to other industries as well. So it applies to aluminum and steel, and those are the two that we focus on, but also fertilizers, cement, hydrogen, and electricity. And if you look at all of those industries, aluminum and steel, and we use steel broadly to include both iron and steel, but those two are the two industries that are really both emissions intensive and highly traded. So together, those metals account for about 14% of the world's carbon emissions if you include scope 1. So not just the production process emissions, but also the electricity emissions that are used in the production of the aluminum and the steel. So that's a lot. And if you look at those other industries, aside from electricity, they're less important emissions wise, but they're also less traded. So like cement is very important emissions wise, but isn't that traded? Fertilizer is less important emissions wise, even though it is traded. But these two industries are both highly traded and very emissions intensive. And in the steel case, more than 20% of output is exported, and in the aluminum case, more than 40% of output is exported.
And it seems like it was also a very big data undertaking then to get all this data. So could you just I think people might not appreciate the scope of data that you have. So if you maybe could talk about that.
Yeah. So once we identified that those industries were most important, we found very detailed data on production and emissions. In the aluminum sector, we have data from every smelter in the world that were acquired from Wood Mackenzie, who collects all of this data. The steel data are from Climate Trace, and they're also at the plant level. And this level of detail really helps the analysis because we get much more precise estimates of how markets are going to react to carbon pricing in the CBAM that accounts for all of this heterogeneity. Like we have a lot of firms that are varying in important dimensions, not just in emissions intensity, and there's a lot of variation there, but in other dimensions as well. And this happens both across countries and within countries. So within China, for instance, some firms are much dirtier than others, and that's true for a lot of countries. So you want to be able to account for what's going on at the plant level, as well as what's going on at the country level.
Yeah, and I should also mention there's some really good econometrics in the paper, which that's not going to be today's discussion, but I really recommend. I think it was some really interesting econometrics and identification there. So
thank you.
Then I would say, so generally I skip that because I just assume it works, but to all the people interested, I really recommend it. And then maybe you can then start looking at some of the results. So we've talked about the sectors and kind of the stylized facts. Then I think your baseline analysis starts from a $100 carbon tax, where you then analyze world with and without the carbon border adjustment mechanism. And that's, I think, where really the interesting analysis then starts. Could you just then maybe talk us through some of the results that you find?
Sure. So when you're thinking about the tax all by itself, it shouldn't surprise any economist listening that taxes reduce consumer and producer surplus and raise government revenue. So that's probably a second week of Econ 101 result. And that happens here too. One thing that was a little bit surprising is the magnitudes aren't huge here. So when you sort of look at the overall welfare effects of implementing carbon pricing with and without the CBAM, globally, it's not really moving the dial very much. We get numbers that are $1 billion, and so you kind of wonder, since not that much is really happening quantitatively, why these policies are so hard to do. But I think our policy analysis also tells you a little bit why. Producers do get hurt by carbon pricing, and they can be expected to object, right? And they do. One of the interesting things about the carbon price border adjustment mechanism is it reduces the producer surplus losses. It doesn't eliminate them, but it makes it so the tax is a little easier to take for the producers. And the cost of that is imposing more of a burden on consumers, because without the border adjustment mechanism, some of the consumer pain is ameliorated by imports that are coming in and offsetting the higher prices that would otherwise occur. So the border adjustment mechanism is creating a little bit of a mini redistribution away from the consumers in the country that's doing the policy and toward the producers. Government revenue is substantial, but mostly from the pricing. You're not getting a lot of revenue out of the CBAM itself, But what the carbon border adjustment mechanism is doing is it's making it easier to carbon price in the first place. And you see that in the results. The countries that are implementing the CBAM will find that it's net helpful to them relative to a situation without a CBAM. But again, the magnitudes here are not enormous.
And when you said easier to implement, that's maybe because the objections from industry might be a little less.
Yes, yes. And the welfare effects are just a tiny bit less bad. Yeah, so that's helpful too.
Exactly, because I think even that's one of the points in your paper, that revenue is a lot less or a lot lower than you might expect. And I think it's just because companies internationally kind of reshuffle their production, whether the cleaner things now get sent to Europe and the dirtier products get sold abroad. And this reallocation also makes it that projected revenues might not be as high as you think.
Yeah, from the CBAM.
From CBAM.
The carbon price is still bringing in a lot of revenue, right? So one thing that countries might think about as they sort of contemplate these policies is like, what are their fiscal needs, and can they come up with any idea that's more efficient than a carbon price? And most of the other taxes create inefficiency, whereas a carbon price helps efficiency by reducing the negative effects of the externalities. So most economists love carbon prices for a reason.
It's true. I'm a big fan of it naturally. So anytime this topic comes up, I'm very positive about it. Now, it's interesting because I think so. One of the main results, and exactly like you say in the paper, producer surplus falls by 23 billion. Mm-hmm. But then it changes after CBAM, where they have an improvement, but then consumers do lose.
Yes.
Could you just maybe talk about those trade-offs? Because I think sometimes people who are not economists might not always have this front and center.
Yes. And I should emphasize that, quantitatively, it's not a huge effect, but it's in the direction that we would expect. So what happens for the producers is because the CBAM offsets the disadvantage associated with serving their own market, right? They recoup some of the lost market share that they would have had if the carbon price had occurred absent the CBAM. So that's a benefit to them. But the consumers, are on the other side of that, and in a nearly symmetrical way, right? The dollars that the producers recoup, the consumers lose as they don't get these cheaper, dirtier imports. But again, when you kind of look at the magnitude of the consumer loss here, I think it shouldn't be standing in the way of policy adoption. It's incredibly small, both as a share of like those markets. But if you think about a consumer's consumption bundle, right? If you're losing, $2 billion in consumer surplus in all of Europe from the aluminum market, it's going to be an indiscernibly tiny share of people's consumption bundles. So the consumer side of this shouldn't be stopping the policy. I think the key is to find a policy that the producers can stomach enough that the government can get it through,
exactly.
And that's where the CBAM helps.
Also, exactly, because producers are more, concentrate, like just easier for them to coordinate. Then, because one thing I thought was really interesting from your paper is that people say, poor income countries or other countries might be impacted by CBAM. What they forget is that prices in Europe will go up, but prices abroad might actually decrease. So it might actually be good for consumers abroad. If you just talk about that mechanism, because I think it's also, even like you did some calculations for India, because it's always the narrative naturally here is that the producers in other countries are also the most vocal about it.
Yeah. So there's diverse effects here, and the consumers in the unregulated markets benefit from this increase in supply. And we've got a table in the paper that I'm kind of thumbing through, but one of the big winners is the U.S. consumers, right? We have a large market and we're importing a lot of these metals. And so when the price falls in the unregulated markets, that helps U.S. consumers. And there are, of course, consumers that lose in the regulated market, and there are producers that win and lose. The winners are the firms that are in the clean energy space, right? They get the benefits of this higher price market without offsetting that entire benefit with additional carbon fees through purchasing of permits, for instance, through the ETS, the emissions trading system. So the beneficiaries tend to be firms with very clean production, and then the losers are the firms that have dirtier production. And if this is administered at the plant level, right, then it's possible that within one country you'd have both winners and losers. Although we talk a little bit about some of the trade-offs later in the paper about administering at the plant level versus the country level.
Cool. Thanks for, and I actually want to get it back maybe. So you've talked about the magnitudes actually that, consumer losses in Europe aren't, they're like 2 billion, so they're not the biggest. Was that surprising to you? Have you gotten reactions to that?
I was a little surprised by that because you hear a lot of anxiety around higher energy prices. And this is, understandable for Europeans who faced a lot of price shocks around Russia's invasion of Ukraine and what that did to their utility bills, the cost of heating their homes. So it's understandable that people would be anxious about energy prices writ large. But in these heavy industries, which are, a substantial share of worldwide emissions, these price effects are really quite small for the typical consumer bundle. So I don't think it makes sense to base climate policy on fear. And just because people are worried about their utility bills to say, oh, we can't raise the cost of a toaster by $1 if it might have metal in it, or, 1 cent, that's really not going to be very much. So people should have perspective and some understanding of the magnitudes when they make these decisions. And also, it's not clear it would be that salient, right? Like if these goods that are really, basic goods, their prices increase, you're not going to see that at the cash register because, these are all input goods into really complicated production processes that have lots of other costs. So it's not going to have a noticeable impact on consumers at the end. Yeah.
So another part of your paper is then we've talked kind of about the goal of protecting domestic competitiveness, which it does. The other goals are to prevent emission leakage. Could you then maybe talk about the emission leakage result that you find?
Yes. So emissions, and let me get the exact numbers here. Emissions go down substantially from the carbon pricing itself. Right. And if you, even at a semi-conservative social cost of carbon, you can see that global welfare, if you included the benefits associated with reduced emissions, is improving with this policy. I think we've chosen to, at least in the working paper version of the paper, to show global welfare just on the private side without looking at the negative effects of the externality. But the emissions reductions are really substantial and would move the policy into a welfare enhancing regime at most social costs of carbon. The emissions reductions are larger with the CBAM than without. It's not an enormous difference because there are these, confounding effects, but you do get more emissions reductions, maybe to the neighborhood of 5 or 10% more with the CBAM than you do without. And this is particularly true when it's just Europe as the regulator, which is kind of the policy experiment we're looking at right now. If you add China in, things get a little more complicated. And I think that's worth looking at too, because China is such an important producer in these heavy industry goods, right? They're a dominant producer really of about 50 to 60% of these metals, right? So ideally China would join a coalition that priced carbon at reasonable levels and levied a carbon border adjustment mechanism too. And in that instance, you don't see as big of an impact with the CBAM, but in a way, the CBAM itself isn't doing the work because you've already got the lion's share of world production carbon pricing. And then the CBAM becomes a sort of an incidental tool where it's effective as sort of expanding countries' incentives to do the carbon pricing in the first place, which is something we show when a country is trying to decide, what are the welfare effects of carbon pricing? They see that it's better for them if they also include a CBAM. And that's something that should sort of start to tilt people toward joining those kinds of regimes.
Exactly. When you say better, it's like it becomes less costly because Europe has already imposed this cost. So it's still costly for China to implement it, but it becomes relatively less costly once the CBAM is in place.
Yes, and China itself should consider doing a CBAM when they implement, right? Because that will also make their policy relative to the baseline where they don't more welfare enhancing for China.
Exactly, and then I think that's, because it's like you say, China's 50 to 60% of emissions. I think that's just, if you hear that statistic, then there's so much, we go almost to the Nordhaus Climate Club vision.
Yes.
I have a dream, I don't know if you want to go that far, but
I don't think it's a ridiculous dream. I mean, so, they're a huge part of emissions in these industries, like worldwide and overall, their footprint is not 50 to 60%, but they're very important in these heavy industries. And they've shown some willingness to do carbon pricing in these industries. If you look at recent Chinese policy change, they've expanded their emissions trading system to include these heavy industries, which is a really a thoughtful approach. I think right now the prices are quite low, so they're pretty far away from where the Europeans are price-wise, but the approach seems to be very similar, and I think that's really promising for a Nordhaus type climate coalition in the future. And if it's the recent COP, there was announced like more coordination on carbon pricing toward moving in that direction, and I think that could be quite helpful.
Exactly, and I think they're really encouraging. There's other evolutions, but I think this is a really cool one because I think I also, I recently talked to a policy expert on CBAM, and one of the things you get because of CBAM, companies abroad start to like measure everything, get the measurement problem right. Because I think people forget how measurement intensive this problem is. Even like the EU ETS, it took a long time just to set up the mechanisms to monitor to ensure that it's right. So you also have this, I think, interesting simulation of how CBAM could encourage green investment, which I thought was a really interesting exercise. Could you just like maybe talk about what you did there and what the idea is?
Yeah, so the idea is to simply allow the emissions intensity to respond to the carbon taxation. And we take sort of as given a semi-elasticity, which one can, vary. And what we do is we simulate sort of a market expansion over time. And you could imagine over time, the world is growing, you're going to need, there's going to be more demand. And then if you allow the new capacity in these sectors to respond by adopting, mitigation steps that lower their emissions intensity, you can find that this policy would in fact amplify emissions reductions and lower the abatement costs because firms would have this chance to respond by adopting cleaner emissions. I mean, one of the tricky things in the short run is we kind of have the smelters that we do and the plants that we do, and so they can expand supply a bit, but we're not really looking as carefully at what the next plants look like. And so letting the emissions intensity respond, I think, is a nice feature of that exercise, and it provides really encouraging results with larger emissions reductions and lower abatement costs.
Exactly. I think that's one thing, it's like reading that paper because sometimes we can get lost in the technical details. I think this paper was just like, hey, this has a lot of really good impacts. So then maybe let me ask you, what's the number one thing you want listeners to take away from it?
Yeah, I think it's something that we've touched on at various points in this interview. Like one of the really hard things about global collective action is the incentive problem. And with climate change, it's a really tricky problem because there's free rider effects between ambitious jurisdictions and less ambitious jurisdictions. But there's also these competitiveness effects where if you impose costs on your industry, you're hurting them relative to other industries in other countries in this global marketplace. So I think the big lesson here is this is a really important new tool. We model some of the key implications of the tool, but one thing we don't really get to is the importance of this in a political economy sense. So I think what the paper can show you is like what happens when we adopt CBAM, and it's a pretty nice story. It's pretty straightforward. It's exactly what you would expect. But I think where it gets really exciting is when we're sort of thinking about like what happens at the COPs down the road and what really pushes countries to solve this global collective action problem. You need some answer to these two jurisdictional spillover questions. And the CBAM really has a big impact in terms of political economy. It makes it easier to carbon price domestically because you have an answer to your domestic industry about competitiveness, and it makes it easier to encourage more and more people to come into the fold and do carbon pricing as governments throughout the world see that they can convert the tariff revenue that would have accrued to the regulating countries into domestic revenue, which every country really needs for their fiscal situation. So I think that's the biggest takeaway.
Thanks. And I think that's actually, when you say it, I can see the process unfolding over many COPs where China raises it a little bit. That makes it a little bit more costly for others who then want to raise it a little bit. And then so you get this iterative process of inching upwards to like, the more global cooperation on carbon. So thanks for that. And then maybe, is there something that surprised you during this paper you hadn't anticipated in advance?
Yeah, I would say that there's two things that I found surprising. One was this flat emissions gradient. I think people kind of make assumptions about emissions intensity that don't fully reflect reality. So as one example, like aluminum is incredibly electricity intensive. So if you're making aluminum in a place where you can rely on hydropower, and many poor countries have hydropower. Mozambique is one example. Then you can actually make your aluminum with a much smaller carbon footprint than people might otherwise think. So there isn't this sense that richer countries in a per capita income sense have lower emissions intensity at the plant level in these industries. And I think that's encouraging for the policy. A second thing that surprised me, at least, and I can't really speak for my co-authors, but it's just kind of the small quantitative effects here, right? When we kind of think about making progress about something that really could affect, if we take all the CBAM industries, maybe as much as a fifth of global emissions, and we're letting like little tiny welfare losses and little tiny consumer and producer losses stand in the way of progress here. I think one of the meta messages is this isn't a lot of negatives associated with doing the right thing here. And you're not going to like have problem offsetting these kinds of costs with other policies. The tax policy is filled with tools where you could offset any of the negatives of this policy and still achieve these massive emissions reductions. So I think the small size of the consumer and producer surplus losses and the welfare losses, I found indirectly encouraging, even though it's kind of hard to like wave in front of referees. Oh, look, small numbers. but the small numbers in this context can be a good thing.
Yeah, thanks so much. I think that was great, and I think we can end it there. So thanks so much for joining. I think your paper exactly can really help put some more numbers and just on the debate to not just get stuck, because I was one of the people who had this idea of varying carbon emissions intensity in my mind. So thanks so much for the paper and
wanting to help. And I think our revision of this paper to satisfy various journals will include other industries too in the stylized facts. And it tends to hold up. For electricity, you see a flat gradient, and for fertilizer as well. We haven't looked at cement, but cement is non-traded anyway. Like there's not people lugging cement across borders.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you so much, Kim.
For the revisions. All right. Take care.